Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Hartford Change Agents Initiative Policy Institute Application Technical Assistance webinar. Before we get started with introductions, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. Please be sure to mute your phones to minimize background noise. To mute your phones, you can press *6. You may unmute your phones at the end of the presentation to ask questions by pressing *7. On the left-hand side of your screen, you should see a chat box. Please feel free to type in questions throughout the webinar. At the end of the presentation, there will be a question and answer portion where you can verbally ask questions by raising your hand or type them into the chat box. Today's webinar is intended to help potential applicants craft and submit a strong application for the Hartford Change Agents Initiative Policy Institute to be held in June. Please take advantage of this opportunity to ask questions and get feedback about your application and proposal. Now let's get started. I am Catherine Dahm, Manager of the Hartford Change Agents Initiative, and I will be your facilitator for today's presentation. Today, I am pleased to be joined by Brian Lindberg, Public Policy Advisor to the Gerontological Society of America, the Hartford Change Agents Initiative, and numerous other national organizations. Mr. Lindberg is the Executive Director of the Consumer Coalition for Quality Healthcare, located in Washington, D.C. He served on the Planning Committee for the National Quality Forum appointed by Vice President Gore, and he spent 10 years in the House and Senate Aging Committees. In today's webinar, we will go over a brief overview of the Hartford Change Agents Initiative and the Policy Institute, then delve into the substantive content related to the Change Agents Policy Institute application process, review criteria, and tips for writing a strong application. We will conclude today's presentation with time for questions and answers. If you have been watching your email and the Change Agents online platform, you already know that it has been a busy year for the initiative. We hope that you are familiar with many of the events that are sponsored by the Change Agents and will see the opportunity to get involved. Please note that all Change Agents Initiative sponsored events are open to all change agents. Your participation in one event does not disqualify you for others. Today we are excited to tell you more about the Change Agents Policy Institute. But before we do, I would like to highlight one of the key benefits of the initiative, the Change Agents online platform. If you are interested in the Policy Institute, you already understand the value of networking, collaborating, and strategic partnering. The platform is a place for change agents to post discussions, share documents and events, and collaborate by finding other change agents with similar or complementary practice change interests. It is important for everyone to complete their profiles, add a photo, and respond to the 5 change agents categories: Hartford affiliation, change industry, industry or setting, domains of practice change, and areas of interest. By completing these areas, you will help provide a robust search in the Change Agents directory. Get connected now so you can find other change agents, and be sure to log in often. If you are invited to attend the Policy Institute in June, you will be required to complete your profile. This is also how we will continue to communicate with you in the future. Now on to Brian.
Thank you, Catherine, and good afternoon, everyone. Let's start here with the Institute's goal. The Institute is one part of the Change Agents Initiative, as you know, and the goal of the Policy Institute is to provide Hartford change agents with the knowledge and skill enhancements necessary to move their practice change issue towards action, or as I like to call these, your change projects. So the politics, the process and procedure, and the policy, we cover all of those. And what we deal with here in Washington, D.C. on a daily basis are those kinds of issues. Many of you who know so much about aging and gerontology, research, data collection, and policy often find what we do here in Washington to be a bit foreign. Let me assure you it's not rocket science. It's very learnable, and that's our goal with the Institute. It's designed to give you the tools you need, get you on the right track for the change success that we hope you have in D.C. or back in your state. So the next slide lists our learning objectives. But I want to start out there by saying we understand that everyone comes into the Institute with different levels of advocacy, knowledge and experiences in working with either your state or federal legislators. So I think we've been successful in using the knowledge and experience of the change agents themselves to improve the Institute's sessions. So although we have a whole set agenda of speakers with a lot of time for interaction, we also try to work in your knowledge and experience into the discussions. So as you look at the objectives there, let's start with the first one. Analyzing your policy issue in the current environment and selecting the appropriate change process. Well, the environment is really important here in Washington, and so in part as you articulate the policy change you want to be involved with, try to show us a little bit about your understanding of the environment in which you're doing it. And I don't mean very simply, well, the Republicans have just won the election, so they're going to take over the Senate in the next Congress, because you have to think more thoroughly about that. The Republicans may actually be more open to floor amendments in the Senate than the Democrats were. So it's not as straightforward. Think about what you want to change, the current environment, are these issues being talked about, et cetera, and try and articulate that to us. Next, we don't always need to change a law to make an improvement in the lives of older people. So develop a strategy for change that integrates your knowledge of the executive or regulatory world as well as the legislative branches. And I think that's self-explanatory, but feel free to come back and ask questions about this later. But we're open to change, whether it's working with an agency to do something, whether it's working with another organization that can help make a change, or whether it involves legislation or using the legislature as a bully pulpit as well. It doesn't always have to be a bill. Sometimes just having someone in a legislature support something can help. Next, frame the issue for various target audiences and decision makers. What we're talking about there is making sure that you're explaining what you want to do in a way that's understandable to policymakers. A lot of times the academics, researchers are very much into the detail, and you need to step back a little bit and think about what you want to change and how you can articulate that, not only in your application, but how you're going to articulate the change you believe is necessary based on your research and everything to a very different audience maybe than you're used to talking to. No one does this alone usually, so understanding and articulating the use of stakeholders, support groups, and everything else, that will be covered as well in our sessions. We cover in a very modest way understanding political action and how it could be used, and that involves campaigns and making contributions and being supportive in other ways to candidates. But we do cover that a little bit in the session. And last on the list, report and evaluate the effectiveness of the chosen or modified strategy and its implementation. And we'll give you some tools not only to help structure your advocacy, your education effort, but also so you can evaluate how well you're doing along the way. So why don't I turn it back to Catherine at this point to talk about the application process itself.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Moving on to the logistics of the application process. It's key to know and mark your calendars for January 15th, 2015, the application deadline. Please be sure to send in all of your materials at one time. Applicants will be notified and will have a need to confirm their attendance in March. And if you are invited to attend the Institute, you will be required to participate in a pre-Institute webinar held on April 30th, 2015 at 3 o'clock p.m. This will help participants prepare for their visits to Washington, D.C. and learn strategies for making appointments with key leaders on Capitol Hill. Anyone who has been touched by a Hartford grant is welcome to apply to any Change Agent sponsored event. Specifically, the Change Agents Policy Institute is unique because this year we will be accepting up to 5 non-Hartford funded individuals to attend the Institute. As noted earlier, those accepted to attend the Institute must complete their Change Agents online platform profile by May 1st, 2015. All are encouraged to complete their profile prior to application submission. Finally, by accepting the invitation to attend the Institute, participants commit to attending the pre-Institute webinar, the entire 2.5-day Institute, and to sharing their experiences with the broader Change Agents community through discussion posts, reports, updates, and other venues where it may be appropriate. Excuse me there. Now that you've determined if you are eligible to apply to the Institute, now it's time to complete your application. Please be sure to send your cover sheet, application, and CV to changeagents365@geron.org. Your application will not be considered complete if all materials are not received by January 15, 2015 at 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Applications will be evaluated by a review team. Reviewers have been provided the following criteria to assess each application. Before starting your application, be sure you can clearly articulate the policy or regulation you are hoping to change. Choose goals that are feasible, actionable, and can have a significant impact. Reviewers will be looking at the stage of practice change each applicant is in, considering if the applicant has taken initial steps to achieving practice change, what stakeholders have been engaged, and if the Institute is timely to facilitate progress and will be beneficial for the applicant. Next, Brian will share some tips for writing a strong application.
Thank you, Catherine. So here is, I've got a handful of tips for you, and then hopefully we'll be able to cover anything else you're thinking about or worried about during the Q&A. But let's start with the first one here, and it's basically identifying a policy that if changed would improve the lives of older adults or their families. So in addition to clearly articulating that, also I think it's helpful as we looked at the applications last year, if you can say a little bit about whether you're looking at the federal, state, or local level or a multi-level effort. So obviously we need to know how you believe the change project is feasible, and so I would just say it's better if it isn't kind of a pie in the sky proposal. For example, don't take on the whole issue of the institutional bias in long-term care. I would be surprised if you could fix that right away with your project. So identify something that's more practical or practicable, or show us how the step that you're going to take gets us closer to resolving that bigger issue. So going back to my example of fixing the institutional bias in the long-term care system, if you believe there is such a thing, then maybe your piece helps us move forward in addressing that, as opposed to the whole package there. So give us a sense of the policy and political environment. I mentioned that a little before, or the context in which the change project will thrive. Try to give us a sense that you understand the policy and political world that you're moving toward. Now we're going to try, as I mentioned before, we're going to try and answer some of those questions and make it more familiar to you, but give us a sense, if you can, that you understand how your small project fits into this bigger picture. One example might be that if you were working on a advanced illness or end-of-life related project that you wanted to make your change agent project, you might give us some context that you understand that there has been a good bit of movement in this area since the healthcare reform ACA was passed, and that the political environment is now more open to making sure that individuals have advanced directives or whatever. Just give us a flavor for your knowledge base in that respect. Also, I suggest that you remember that your proposal is really about action and not about research. And that isn't to belittle research in any way, but your project probably shouldn't be, well, I'd like to research X, Y, and Z and put a proposal together for funding for that. That's really, we're talking about you already have a sense of what the situation is, maybe based on research you've done, and now you want to actually get someone, excuse me, some policymaker potentially to help improve that situation. So it's a much more action-oriented approach. And think about, when you think about that action, what is it that you would be asking someone to do, a lawmaker or a regulator? What is it that you'd ask them to do to fix this, the issue that you've described? And then finally, for this slide, I think it's important that even though this isn't about another research project, that you demonstrate to the extent you can in the application your research or expertise area around the policy that you want to change, because obviously I think that if you make a good case that you've developed or know and understand the research in a particular area, we're going to be more likely to think you'll be successful in your project itself. On the next slide, I just have a few more. The first one is this, the so what question. And we have a speaker that we've used a number of years for different projects, and he always, after some, he's a guy who comes in and helps us all frame our issues better for policymakers, make sure they're understandable and clear, kind of like the elevator speech. But he always is hopeful that after he hears your elevator speech or your presentation, that he doesn't feel like saying, so what? Because what he wants to be saying is, wow, we really need to do something about this. So when you think about your proposal and you're presenting it, and we have a panel of our Catherine and our colleagues here in D.C., all with aging and health expertise who go through the applications, you don't want them to say, so what, as they look at your application. Make the case and make them say, wow, this is really a great area. It's important, and I think they're really onto something here with what they'd like to do to make change. The next couple there provide an initial assessment of stakeholder involvement and provide a sense of how you would work on an interprofessional level toward your goal. It's pretty straightforward, but if you can help us understand that you know some of the players involved in your issue and know how to interact with them, that can always be helpful, even though that's going to be part of the training, the institute itself, to talk about grassroots and grass tops and other areas. Give us a little bit of a feel for your understanding there. And then finally, brag a little bit about your abilities to pull this off, because we have had some very successful change agent projects and change agents, and we need to hear why you think you can do this and make it happen. And then on my last slide there, this comes up sometimes when a university has a very strict policy or approach on how their staff and faculty interact with Congress or the state legislature or agencies. So we suggest that you check this out, at least in a basic way before you apply. Let us know if you need any advice or a letter or something explaining what you'd be doing. But there are cases, we have actually over the years when we used to have the Hartford Faculty Scholars Program running out of Washington here with GSA, and I used to put on a program with them. There were a couple cases where the institution, the university, actually had their local lobbyist here in Washington go to meetings with the scholar at the time that was coming into D.C. So that's always possible. It's unlikely, but you just want to make sure that you're not out there doing education and advocacy around a particular project. Your university finds out about it. They're the last one to find out when it's in the newspaper that you've been meeting with someone in Congress and they're about to introduce a bill or something like that. So keep that in mind. And then the last point there is, I'm not so sure it's a tip as it is a warning and a question, I guess, to you, and that is this isn't really I don't look at this kind of education and advocacy as just a couple days in Washington, D.C. It's really advocacy for a project like this is often a long-term process, and I'm not saying you're getting yourself into a 10-year commitment, but when I helped create the Elder Justice Coalition with Bob Blancato more than 10 years ago, and we were helping to write the Elder Justice Act here in D.C., we had no idea that it would be until last night at about 9 o'clock before we found out, that's 11, 12 years later, that we finally got our first direct appropriation for that law. So it took us 10 years to get it passed, basically, and now several more to get direct funding. But this is what being an advocate is all about, and it's a great, rewarding experience. But when you think about applying to come to the Institute, think about the longer term that you'll come to the Institute, and then we're hoping for at least a year after that, you're very involved trying to get your project done. And I think in most cases, people will keep working on these projects. They may end up being modified. They may be expanded. They may evolve, but you'll keep working on them until you feel that you've reached some point of completion or success. So those are my tips, and I'm happy to turn this over to Q&A now and try and be helpful and supportive of your application. And then also keep in mind that if you have questions once you start writing your application, that you can contact Catherine, and if she thinks that I'm the better person for a particular question, she'll link you up with me as well. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll open it up for questions.
So as I noted earlier in the presentation, you can either raise your hand using the tool in your chat box, and we can call on each person to ask your question verbally, or you can use the chat feature here, and I will say your question for you. I also hear a little bit of background noise. Can everybody please make sure that you have your phones muted by pressing *6? Thank you very much.
And then, Catherine, they need to put *7 in to then get off of the mute?
Yes, Brian, thank you for reminding me of that.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So any questions?
Hello, Catherine.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, this is Nicola.
Hi, Nicola. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I would. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to connect on the computer side of it. I had a glitch in the computer, but I know you and I spoke last week, and you mentioned perhaps this might be a question better directed towards Brian. So I thank you guys for putting this on. This has been very, very helpful. Brian, I want to ask you, you mentioned something that I think is really important, since I think, I'll speak for myself. We're kind of pursuing this as we're thinking about it in terms of policy pieces and changes in policy. However, I think most of our training, at least my training, is more research oriented. So what would be the best avenue to try to think about some of the, because I really honed into what you said in the beginning about demonstrating the political context and the understanding of that political context. I think that's obviously very key for any policy change. How might we start to think about which committees, whether they're, for example, I'm looking at the issue of older veterans and helping older veterans get more effective PTSD treatments. And I know that that's a very, it's an issue that has a lot of that's been in a lot of controversy recently. So how might I go about? I know I could start very generally looking at, for example, the Veterans Affairs committees and those things of that nature, which I have. But are there any other committees or other avenues that you might suggest?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. And I think there's a couple parts to the answer. First is I would focus primarily on the understanding you have of the issue, what change you want to make, and articulate that. That's the most important, I think. And if you can show us some of the, in the sense of your knowledge base, your research understanding, a little bit of the context that you see it fitting in right now, that can be very helpful, I think. It improves your application. But the second part of the answer is, aside from being happy to chat with you offline about the different players that you might want to interact with, we have a lot of time once each applicant has been accepted to have one-on-one. We have a pre-institute call where it's a webinar kind of based call like this, where we work through how you make decisions about who to meet with, how to set up appointments, all of that. And then last year, for example, I would say about half of the participants in the Institute chose to interact with me by telephone on a one-on-one basis before they came to Washington, where I worked with them to think through who some of the key players were. So we had, for example, instances where I would suggest when they were here in Washington that people met with, I could identify key staff people, say on Leading Age, which is a major housing and long-term care entity here, used to be called ASA, AARP, the Administration on Aging, the VA. So I'm just mentioning CMS. Those are some of the entities that I linked up for folks who are coming to DC beyond Hill people. So I think you're. It's great that you're on the right track and eager to get to that point. But I would just suggest for the application phase, you don't need to, try to overwhelm us with your knowledge of everybody in DC that you'd meet with. Obviously, it would be good if you can show some understanding of some of the players, like I mentioned. But we will work one-on-one if you that's kind of everybody's choice, with people to help figure out how to make their several days here in D.C. most effective.
Okay, that helps tremendously. I just want to add one thing as well too. Part of the research, I'm a VA Hartford scholar, and part of my research is actually looking at developing more effective treatments for PTSD for older veterans. And I don't want to be my basis for this policy piece is from a report from the National Institute of Medicine, which was very critical of the current PTSD treatments. And I want to be mindful, since this is obviously a policy institute and having a little sense of an understanding of politics, I don't want to bite the hand that feeds me. So I know that some of the things that I want to introduce as changes in policy, which will eventually lead to changes in practice, might be very controversial. So do you have any tips for that as well too? I hope I explained myself in a correct way. But
mm-hmm. Well, I'm aware of the IOM study, although I didn't read it all. I read a couple articles about it, and I guess a summary. I guess I would say that let's just say, regardless of which study it was, because it's a good example. There was a recent IOM study on end-of-life issues as well. I think that it's important that in the process of deciding what you want to spend your time on, you are practical and realize if you've got an IOM study in front of you, you may not be able to fix everything. Although it's true that if I'll give you an example, that if your goal was to come to Washington and to convince anyone, some member of Congress, to introduce a bill that included all of the recommendations that the IOM made on the PTSD treatment at the VA for older adults, that could be a goal, just to get something introduced. The process of getting it all done may be something that would never happen because, as you say, some things may be controversial. Another approach would be to look at that IOM study and think about, are there what state am I from? Do I have a member of Congress who cares about these issues? Could I get her or him to help me get? Let's knock off the low-hanging fruit first. Here's some things that I think were articulated in this study that Congress has been so focused on the recent VA crises that they haven't dealt with. So here's what I want to get done. So you can go either way, but my suggestion to most of you, and the reason I'm taking more time than you might think for one person's question, is I think this applies to these things I'm saying. I think they apply to everybody. You can think big, and you can think, but you're going to have to show us that you'll move the big issue a step forward in some way, or think smaller and figure out what is it that, because of your knowledge and your research and because of who you are, that you're choosing to do A, B, and C instead of the whole alphabet of and see, incremental change is important too. So anyway, that's the way I would look at it. And when you get to that point when you're trying to make those decisions about which way to go, excuse me, I'm happy to give you my 2 cents worth.
Thank you. That helps tremendously. Thank you.
Brian, we had a question on the chat board here. Can you please explain a little bit more in depth as to what stage in practice change you expect applicants to be in at the time of applying to the Policy Institute?
Yeah, it's a really tough question because now this is only the second year of the Policy Institute, and this is a much more kind of advanced approach at this than the former program we did with the Hartford geriatric social work scholars. And we had some nurses and docs in that too. But so this is, I think, what we don't really want is for someone to say, I'm thinking about doing some research in a particular area, and not really, I mean, that isn't, the research in and of itself, we probably wouldn't consider to be change, if you will. But beyond that, we had last year, as I said in the first year, we had a nice range of where people were. We had a woman from California, a local ombudsman, who had identified a real problem in nursing homes, and she had done the background needed to understand that she had a really powerful issue that people might care about, and she could take it forward to the state legislature. And so she was at the point where she really needed to learn about how legislatures worked and how she should frame her issues and how she should build coalitions and things like that. We had a number of people who were much further along but really wanted to learn about certain aspects of messaging and working in partnership with other groups, and we had people who had done the research and only now had thought about their issue. And I think in some cases it actually, just applying for the Institute, forced them to narrow their focus, because I know some researchers and professors out there are doing a lot in a lot of areas, and they cover a lot in their coursework that they do, et cetera. So in some cases we felt like it got them to focus on things that were doable. Most people, though, really, I mean, we really, a couple people we thought that were not accepted ended up being people who might apply this year because they just needed to do a little bit more of their basic background research. Any other questions?
If you don't feel comfortable saying your questions on the phone, please don't forget you do have the opportunity to use the chat box as well.
Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you are interested in applying for the Institute, and I hope you do. And I have to say, it's so exciting for those of us in D.C. to read about, hear about, and then work with all of the change agents who have projects for change. It's just refreshing, even though Congress is somewhat dysfunctional in recent years. There still is the opportunity for change, and I've experienced it firsthand. Even in this Congress, a number of pieces I have drafted have become law. So it isn't out of the question. It's possible, and it's always great to hear new ideas coming from all across the country. So thanks for joining us today.
We hope that you all enjoyed today's technical assistance webinar. Please feel free to contact me directly by January 1st, 2015 with any questions that you have about your application. Please see my email address posted on the slides right there. It's kzom@geron.org. And please note that applications are to be submitted to changeagents365@geron.org. This concludes today's session. Thank you again.